Okay, I'm going to go ahead and get started. My name's Meghan Marino. I'm a licensed genetic counselor here at the Cleveland Clinic Cole Eye Institute. I work very closely with Dr. Singh. This session this afternoon, or late morning, I guess it is really about the genetics of uveal melanoma and sort of the testing process involved with this condition. In my opinion, we are here for you. So I'm going to give, kind of a brief overview on genetics of UM, and then we have two other speakers for this panel, but my ultimate goal is really to leave time at the end for your questions. And it sounds, based on the last panel, that you guys really have some good ones. So I'm looking forward to discussing all of those questions with you here in a little bit. Okay, so genetics is complicated, mutations are complicated, genes, DNA, you hear all of these words, all of these sort of abstract concepts. I'd really like to kind of take you back to science class, if you will, and explain to you exactly what these things are, why they cause disease, why some people are more predisposed to uveal melanoma compared to other people, and help you hopefully better understand these terms and these concepts. So genetic variations are really linked to most diseases, really. When I'm talking about genetic variations, I'm talking about specific changes in a gene. And so I often hear people say, oh, well, she has the gene for breast cancer. We all have the gene for breast cancer. We all have 2 copies of those genes that cause breast cancer. What happens is there are specific changes within those genes that cause those genes not to work the way that they should. And those types of changes, those mutations, are what ends up leading to a problem and cause disease. So each gene has a job that it's supposed to do, and we're going to go into more detail about that in a little bit. You can have, thinking about genetic defects or these mutations, it's really like having a wrong or a missing ingredient within a recipe. So you can have the flour, but if you put too much in, you're going to have a really stiff cake, okay? It's not going to taste very good. Okay. So if we were to take one cell within our bodies, one skin cell, one tumor cell, one cell, and you were to look at it underneath the microscope, you would see these little wormy-looking structures, and these wormy-looking structures are called chromosomes. Along the chromosomes, then, are the individual segments of DNA, and any given segment of that DNA makes up what we call a gene. Again, each gene has a job that it is supposed to do. Some genes are expressed in very specific tissues. Other genes are expressed in one tissue. Some genes are expressed throughout your entire body. So there's differences in what a given gene's job is and where that gene has its job. And the ultimate job of a gene is to make a protein, which is actually the product that does the work. So I was talking about those wormy-looking structures, or the chromosomes. This is a picture of it here. And again, if you were to look at one cell underneath a microscope, you could line up the chromosomes in order from largest size to smallest size. And typically, so in a normal, healthy cell, we should see a total of 46 chromosomes. 2 chromosome number 1s, 2 chromosome number 2s, so on and so forth. And then the last pair of chromosomes, let me see if this works. Oh, sorry. I'm supposed to have a pointer. Here we go. The last pair of chromosomes here are the sex chromosomes, and they determine whether you're male or female. So females have 2 X's, males have 1 X and 1 Y. And again, we typically get 1 copy of each chromosome from our mothers. The other copy of each chromosome comes from our fathers. This is what a normal cell looks like throughout your entire body. This is the DNA that you were born with, and this is what it should typically look like. When we think about uveal melanoma, though, and the chromosomes of a uveal melanoma tumor, what can happen is we can end up with changes in this particular chromosome, chromosome number 3. And this is the kind of biggest genetic change that is associated with uveal melanoma. And so typically what we see, and when we see patients, if a patient presents to us, immediately we can say to that patient, if you have a uveal melanoma, your risk for that melanoma to metastasize is 50%. That's just the empiric data that we have available. That's the basic risk that any person with UM has. What we can do to help refine that risk and know if someone is more or less likely to metastasize, one of the things that we can do is look at chromosome number 3. So if we see that a person's uveal melanoma tumor has the normal 2 copies, that's associated with a good prognosis. Those patients are less likely to have a metastasis. If, however, one of those chromosome number 3 is missing, then we see a problem. We call that problem monosomy 3. Mono means 1, somy means chromosome, 3 means the 3rd chromosome. So if there's 1 copy of chromosome number 3, that is associated with a higher risk for metastasis. That is a situation where the liver needs to be a little bit more carefully screened. And this is, again, one of the most common genetic variations that we see in uveal melanoma tumors that are associated with a higher risk, okay? There are some other genetic factors, again, thinking about the tumor tissue itself, that we can see, and some of those other factors can actually be additionally damaging, and some can actually be protective. And so one of the other chromosomes that we look at is chromosome number 8, specifically the longer arm of chromosome number 8. So if I go back to my pictures of my chromosomes here, we call the top part of a chromosome the P arm, and the bottom part the Q arm. And so chromosome number 8, let me find it here. So the bottom part of chromosome number 8, if there are genetic changes within that region, that is associated with, again, a higher risk of metastasis in about 40% of uveal melanoma tumors. Additionally, the 6th, chromosome number 6, if we look at the short piece of that chromosome, the upper part, if there is an extra piece of the upper part of that chromosome, that's actually associated with protection. So that in that case, that's actually a good thing. And so what we can do when we do testing, we can look at all of these different changes, look at these different chromosomes, put all of this data together, and generate a person's individual risk profile. There's also 2 particular genes that are associated with genetic mutations that we see in approximately 90% of uveal melanoma tumors. These 2 genes are GNAC and GNA11. What's the purpose of this? Why am I telling you this? If we know that about 90% of uveal melanoma tumors have mutations in these particular genes, one of the things that we can do when we do the testing is to look at these 2 genes and see if those mutations are there or not. If they're there, that's kind of confirmation that the tissue that we're sampling and testing is truly uveal melanoma tissue, and it wasn't just a different type of a tissue sample that happened to be taken during the biopsy. So again, I was talking about these genes. Again, a gene is just a piece of a chromosome that has a special job within the body. We have close to 25,000 genes within our bodies, and again, they're expressed at different levels within different tissues. They have different jobs. When we do genetic testing for uveal melanoma, we are not doing Angelina Jolie testing, okay? So I have a lot of patients that come to me and they say, well, I really want to do this testing because I want to know what the risk is to my children. Or I have a sister or a brother and I want to know what their chances are for uveal melanoma. That's a really great thought, but this type of testing that we're talking about is not testing like Angelina Jolie had, where it has implications for family members. So the testing for uveal melanoma is solely prognostic testing. It is not testing that is able to tell us whether or not family members have that risk for developing uveal melanoma. And the reason for that is because, again, going back to the genes and the mutations that we're looking at when we do the testing. So Angelina Jolie had a mutation in a gene called BRCA2. That gene causes, when there's a mutation, that gene causes hereditary breast and ovarian cancer syndrome. This is a cancer syndrome where the person is born with a mutation in their BRCA2 gene. Because they are born with it, it is inherent in all of their cells and all of their DNA. That person is more likely than other people to develop breast and ovarian cancer. The mutations that we look at in uveal melanoma, so that monosomy 3, the GNA11, the GNAQ, all of those different genetic variations, those are what we call somatic mutations. So those are mutations that are isolated specifically to the tumor tissue. If we were to look at your uveal melanoma tumor and then say take a biopsy from, I don't know, your colon's gonna theoretically look normal, whereas your uveal melanoma tissue is likely to have those changes in it. So again, when we're thinking about testing, we're looking at the DNA specific to the tumor, not the DNA that you are born with and the DNA that you share in common with your family members. Does that make sense to everyone? Okay. That's a really, really important concept, I think, for people to understand when thinking about genetic testing for this. So again, the somatic mutations are the ones that we are actually doing testing for. Now, I heard some questions a little bit ago about, I think someone mentioned that they had a BAP1 mutation and some other things. There are cases where the person develops uveal melanoma because they have one of these hereditary cancer predisposition syndromes. That testing is different than the testing that I'm primarily focused on today and the testing that you guys are going to hear additional information about from our other two speakers. The BAP1 gene is a gene that is supposed to, when it's working correctly, prohibit cancer from forming. If it's not working correctly, then cancer is more likely to develop. There is an association if patients are born with a BAP1 mutation, those people are more likely to develop uveal melanomas and certain types of kidney cancers, along with some other types of cancers. Again, that is a germline mutation. That is a mutation that the person is born with and makes them predisposed or more likely to develop a tumor. The majority of uveal melanoma cases, though, are not of that nature and are more of this somatic nature where these mutations just occur by chance. So again, when we think about gene mutations, there's many, many different types of mutations that can occur within a gene. If you think of a gene like being a book and the DNA spelling or the sequence of that book is made up of 4 letters, A's, C's, G's, and T's. But really, you can have any combination of changes within those letters that can affect the way the gene works. You could have a totally missing page. You could have a totally missing chromosome. You could have an extra piece of a chromosome. You could have one letter that's swapped out for a different letter that causes it not to work right. So there's many different types of mutations that can be found. One of the things that the testing does, and again, it depends on the testing method. Some testing methods are better at detecting some of these mutations than others. So if you're looking for a large chunk of a gene or a chromosome that's missing or extra, you want to do one type of method. If you are, for instance, looking to see if a person has a germline or a BAP1 mutation, you might want to do a different type of a method. And so testing methods are really important based on the types of mutations that you want testing for. So again, just to kind of review, genetic mutations in uveal melanoma are typically not inherited. They are, again, somatic mutations that occur by chance within a group of cells in the eye that end up leading to cancer. The results of doing genetic testing for uveal melanoma, again, they do not impact the family members. And I am going to back up a little bit because certainly the results impact the family, right? If someone has testing, someone's going through cancer, of course any results are going to impact the family. What I mean by that is that the results are not going to make any family member at a higher or lower risk for developing cancer. Again, this is specifically giving us prognostic information specific to the patient. So the patient in front of us that has the uveal melanoma, we can do a prognostic test, which will help us determine, are they at the end of the spectrum where they are a lower risk for metastasis, or are they at the other end of the spectrum where there is a higher risk for them to have a metastasis? The testing process itself is relatively simple, actually. So usually a biopsy is taken during a surgical procedure. That sample is sent to a laboratory. The lab then looks, depending on the lab and on the testing methods used, because there are some different ones, they look at these genetic changes that are associated with the uveal melanoma. They then generate a report given back to the clinician, and that report basically says the person is more associated with a good prognosis or a bad prognosis, more likely to metastasize or less likely to metastasize. There is always a chance that we might get a result when we do testing. So contrary to CSI and television, genetic testing is not perfect, especially in regards to this particular condition. There is always a possibility for a result that's a little bit uncertain, that we don't really know how to interpret. The main reason for this is due to what we call tissue heterogeneity. So it's possible that you could have a tumor, and 50% of those tumor cells might have one type of genetic profile, and maybe 20% have another type of a genetic profile, and then maybe 30% have yet another type of genetic profile. So depending on the biopsy taken and the group of cells that make up that biopsy and the cells that are tested, it may not necessarily be reflective of the tumor as a whole. And so if you take a sample from the tumor cells that have 2 copies of chromosome number 3, that's a good test result. But what if there's other cells within that tumor that weren't in that biopsy that actually have monosomy 3? That's something that we can't necessarily control for or be able to determine. So knowing that ahead of time is really important, because that's why testing is never 100%. We can generate a risk profile, but we can never say with certainty that if you get a good prognosis or a bad prognosis, that you are for sure not or going to have a metastasis. Another question that I get a lot is, well, I have this, should I have the testing? I think that this is actually a really personal decision. Some patients come to me and they hear all of my information, and we spend a half hour or an hour talking about the test and what it can and what it cannot tell us, and they end up saying to me, you know what, Megan, I really just don't think I want to know. I think that I would just have a lot of anxiety if I were to get a bad test result. I don't have a lot of support at home. I don't think that I'm the type of person that could necessarily handle the results of this test. That's okay. And then I have other patients that are the total opposite. They say, I want anything and anything that you can do on me, poke and prod away. There's no right or wrong answer from my standpoint. I think there is a right or wrong or a better answer for each patient. And I think each patient and each patient's family, knows those situations better than I do, how you can personally cope with test results like this. And so again, we offer it to all of our patients here, but I typically have these conversations with them and ultimately leave it up to the patient. Another thing that's important is these tests aren't free. They cost money. And so does insurance cover it? Does it not cover it? How much is it? Are you willing to pay out of pocket for it if it doesn't cover it? These are all things to consider when undergoing a test like this. So that kind of is my summary of genetics and uveal melanoma. I will be here for additional questions at the end, but I want to hold off on questions for now until our other 2 speakers talk. Again, there's a lot of psychological and psychosocial implications of the testing, and I think that's where our next speaker, Jamie, can really touch upon in a little bit more detail for you. Thank you.